thank you for joining our last session of the day, which is a panel session. We've had a great many really interesting discussions and presentations from the 3 sessions earlier today, and this last session is a little bit different in that we will have a set of speakers with a set of presentations and slides, but it's more a discussion on reflections of the day as a whole and the topic of skills and how that relates to research and policy more generally. So we have 4 panelists with us today. We have Frank Bowley from the Department for Education, who's the Deputy Director in charge of skills policy analysis and further education. We have Laura van der Erve, who is a senior research economist in the education and skills sector at the Institute for Fiscal Studies. We have Dr. Catherine Robinson, who is a senior lecturer in applied economics at the University of Kent. And we have Urvashi Parashar, who is joining us from the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities as part of the Levelling Up Taskforce. And there should be lots of time available for questions from all attendees. So if there are any questions, then I encourage you to put them in throughout the session. We will first start off by having each one of the panelists take a little bit of time to explain a little bit about their position on how they see the current state of play between skills measurement and its use in policy and research, so the current situation as well as where they see the future of both of those elements, and maybe a bit of a wish list as to what they would like to see in this area. And then we will open it up to a set of questions for a mixture of specific panelists or all panelists at once. So we will start it off first with Frank. You can take the reins.
Okay. Hi, Georgie. As Georgie introduced it, I actually introduced my old title, which was current up to about last Friday. But the reason I mention it is my new job title is probably even more useful. So I was the Deputy Director looking at FE analysis and data. And obviously, I have a lot to say within that regard, and it's been key for my job, which I've been doing for many years, on thinking about how you measure skills and how you sort of look at outcomes and which training produces good outcomes. But also, if anyone was reading Urvashi's department's levelling up white paper, they would have seen a reference to this new unit for future skills, whose job it is to actually bring the skills and jobs data together and make it useful for researchers and for decision makers, so they can use it to work out what skills they should be what skills are in demand, and what training gets people the skills and into those jobs. But I'll come back to that in a second. But I think both of that, my new job in some ways is even more sort of relevant to how we measure skills and how we use that. And I think in some ways that's my 100% job now. But just to sort of say, I think there's at least 3 ways that we are using skills measures in the Department for Education. There's probably many other ones, but there's 3 big ones springs to mind. The first one is obviously we have a huge amount of work on accountability. I mean, we set ourselves targets and we make them public so people can see that we actually are delivering the skills we would say are doing, and in some ways to drive progress and to give you a focus for planning. There's been lots of examples of those. If anyone remembers long enough back, there was the LUHC review, which came up with increasing numbers of people's level 2, 3 and 4 sort of participation. There's the recent levelling up white paper, which again has a target to effectively grow skills, useful high value skills in the less developed parts of the country, and to and the whole of the country as well. And the Department of Education did a lot of work thinking about, actually, for instance, the LUHC reviews were very clunky measures, and can we come up with something better? And we have something called a skills index, where we we adjust the skills that people achieve by the value they have in the labour market, and say, so if we have, for instance, fewer level 2 but more level 3, what actually is that, and if the overall numbers have gone down, what does that mean for the value? Effectively, are we getting more people getting the higher qualifications in more valuable skills, is the way we describe it. So and that's very much accountability measure. Second reason we often look at measures of skills is evaluation. There's lots of money spent. There's a huge amount of money spent on skills and education, both particularly public money. There is probably approaching £4 billion in FE, probably even more in HE, and again even more in schools. And are we sure that how we're spending the money actually is making a difference? And often there's trials and experiments, and measuring those are and the outcomes of that is terribly important, and seeing how to do that well. And there's been a lot of work in our longitudinal education outcome database, LEO database, which allows us to look at outcomes and tweak our policies again to that. And the final sort of thing, I think we often look at skills measurement, and which is going to be the core of my new job, is this country is one of the biggest skills mismatch, or as the Leach report review pointed out, is this country is one of the biggest funders of education skills in public expenditure, but we don't necessarily get the best bang out of our buck. And can we invest in other skills better, and sort of be able to look at what skills are required, what training produces those skills and the best outcomes, and give that to the market so the market becomes more responsive. So that use of measurement to lead and inform data decision making. So that's, I think, how we're using it. Just one more minute to think. You asked me where is going in the futures. Well, I think we're doing relatively well, or very well, in some key areas. So I've always mentioned the LEO database, longitudinal education outcomes. And that, I think, has been a game changer, in as much as anyone under the age of about 30, we know what they've studied, where did they pass or fail, and what have they gone on to employed, and what they're paid. And that's longitudinal, tens of millions of databases. So that's been extremely useful for understanding what skills are worth what. And as an economist, I found that incredibly useful. But having said that, there's huge gaps in that. We don't know the skills that are out of the population. We know their qualifications. Ultimately, we don't know their skills. We know what they're qualified in. It'd be better we knew what skills they had, but also what skills the people have picked up, which haven't gone through the publicly funded system, which probably form the greater number of skills out there. We have very little information on that. We don't really have very good information on skills in demand, and we don't need to know how to join that up. And that's one thing the Unit for Future Skills is going to be focusing on in the next couple of years. And the final one, and I'll finish there, is what more do we need beyond that? Is, I think a lot of the analysis has been at the macro aggregate level. I mean, some of it's been regional, but it's been getting lots of data together and seeing what happened. And there's a sense about personalizing that data, and can we actually get people's individual data, which they upload, but also can we give them a sense about what people like them are doing, and to help individuals make their own decisions. And I think that's another area where I think we should look at. I'll finish there. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Frank. Yeah, lots of follow-up questions I'm sure we'll have. I'll next pass over to Urvashi.
Hi there. Sorry, there was a delay. The buttons didn't click fast enough. Thank you for having me here today. Frank already introduced me, for which I'm grateful. I'm Urvashi Parashar. Since June 2021, I've been heading the evidence and analysis of the Levelling Up white paper in the Levelling Up Taskforce, which was originally in the Cabinet Office and now in DLUHC. And for those of you who managed to go through at least a quarter of the 350-page document, plus the 50-page technical annex, my team and I, we led on the diagnosis of geographic disparities, which was the first chapter, and also the 12 missions, one of which is a skills mission, as Frank mentioned. So there is clearly a lot of focus on skills in the white paper. I just also wanted to say that one of the things, I guess one of the fundamental differences you may have noticed in this white paper narrative relative to others is the focus on this 6 capitals framework, of which human capital is one. A lot of other academics like Diane Coyle have come up with a similar conceptual framework to understand which outcomes we should be focusing on to reduce or address spatial disparities. But the important thing here is the interaction between the capitals. And I wanted to point that out because usually in the way we have, in the past described human capital or skills in academia or in policy has always been in isolation of other things that might be happening. But I think what the white paper does is recognizes the interdependencies, the interconnectedness, and this semantically humans are basically interacting with other capitals like social, financial, and physical. So in terms of measurement, I think the biggest challenge, but also opportunity here, is to get better at situating skills in the context of other capitals and how people in places are both influenced and affected by what's happening around them, and also having an impact on a place. So what are some of the other questions? Just following up from what Frank said, it's really important to bring the supply and the demand side together. So it's not just that we look at measuring the stock of skills. It's also important to look at the flow and the role of local employers. Because as we know, we are good at some things, but not good at other things. There is a big issue of graduate mobility, which largely disproportionately benefits London, but that also creates brain drain from other parts of the country. So it's really important to understand, first of all, how do you retain graduates, but go beyond graduates and look at how do you create good jobs and high quality skills provision. So the skills mission in the Leveling Up white paper, it really focuses on high quality. And I think definitionally, this is where we are going to be working with Frank's, team, his earlier team, on understanding, what is high quality training and retraining, because qualifications is one thing, acquiring qualifications is one thing, but skills is a lifetime learning concept. So I will just stop there, but I think just concluding to say important to situate skills amongst the other capitals in the spatial context. Important to look at good jobs and good skills, not just higher value, like graduate skills or graduate qualifications. And important to understand both the supply and the demand side of the equation.
Great, thank you, Vashi. Yeah, a few of those points did come through in some of the early sessions. Hopefully we can elaborate on them in a short while. I'll pass over to Catherine now. Oh, I think you're still on mute, Catherine.
Thank you, Gueorguie. Thank you. Sorry. It's been a really interesting day, and I guess I come at this with two hats, really. There's obviously the researcher hat that is very much based on the skill mismatch project that we're currently bringing to an end with Michaela Vecchi, and she presented our findings in the first session this morning around this area of mismatch, and I'm really thinking about the labour market winners and losers, I guess, to some extent, and looking at how they rank, and really trying to understand what causes people to be in one place or another, and how we can best facilitate movement across that from obviously the less happy, the less fortunate, the losers, as it were. And I think we need to do that for a number of reasons. We need to do that because of well-being for individuals. We need to do it for productivity reasons. And we also need to do it for ensuring value for money. As we've already said, we invest a lot in education in the UK. So I think there are three real sort of drivers of why we need to ensure that people are in the right jobs. I think all of this takes place against a backdrop of a situation where we may have expectations in terms of where we want people to be situated, but it's very much about bringing together that supply and the demand side, but also recognizing that there may be some work to be done on that demand side in terms of upgrading those jobs and moving the UK towards a more highly productive economy. So I think there's some interesting things there. I thought Frank's point was quite interesting around the idea that we might look towards maybe optimization of a skills portfolio for the UK, trying to understand what we need, when and where at the national level. So I thought that was something that I could certainly buy into, and I'd be interested in knowing a little bit more about it. But as I said at the beginning, I think I have two hats here. So as well as the researcher hat, I also represent providers of a form of education, as many of us in the room do. And my day job is as a deputy dean for a business school. So this is something that I can think about with my two hats on, which I think is quite interesting. So it was clear to me that there needs to be considerable work done around the linkages between FE, HE, and the local authorities and businesses and SMEs, and somehow working at that kind of nexus between where everyone sits, so that we better translate the needs and respond to those. I think that's quite interesting. And I thought there was also another point around the idea that came through quite strongly today, the idea that we have very much, certainly in higher education, more of a focus on knowledge-based education as opposed to skills-based. And I think there's a big shift in what we're seeing, certainly from a policy perspective, but also in terms of the calls from businesses to provide more of those skills-based provisions, certainly in higher education. And there was some recent work done in the CIPD, for example, for accrediting HRM programs that was very much more skills-based rather than knowledge-based. And so I think there are lots of spaces where you can see that happening. So I think from my perspective, I'd like to understand a few things better. I'd like to understand regional variations much better. And that's why I found that last session really, really fascinating. The extent to which you are very much sort of determined by where you are in the region, and the extent to which there is movement. And also focusing on performance. So from a productivity perspective, looking at the mismatch, how much does that mismatch cost us in terms of lost productivity or productivity foregone? And that all comes back to this idea of data and accessibility of data. And I think it's improving, and I think it's got better, but I think we're still lacking some of those key data sets, like joint employee, linked employer data sets that would enable us to do that kind of thing. So I'll leave it there, seeing as the kids are kicking up a storm in the background. Yeah, just really interesting day. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, another point about the remaining data sets, I think is hopefully maybe something we'll come back to, because it's fascinating what work is already ongoing with the data sets and the methods that people were presenting earlier in the day. But as you say, clearly there's more that needs to be done. Before we go over to specific questions, and just to remind people to put questions into the Q&A chat if they want to ask all or one specific panelist, we'll pass over to Laura van der.
Hi, yeah, thanks very much. So yeah, basically thinking about kind of, the relationship between skills measurement and research. Well, I would definitely say like most of my research agenda of the last few years has very much been enabled by a huge new data set, the longitudinal education outcomes data set Frank already mentioned. And this has really like allowed us to look at so many things we couldn't do in such detail before. So for example, some of it has been looking at the returns to different degrees, I think particularly higher education in the labour market, but rather than having to look overall, really being able to dig more deeply into not just which university, but which specific degrees kind of really help people increase their earnings later on. And I think that's quite important because it really shows you that not having such detailed data, not being able to measure that well, you just really underestimate the heterogeneity. Like say a university might be good on average, but actually below that, there's going to be certain degrees that are fantastic and certain degrees that really are not. So I think having that level of detail really just gives you a much better sense of kind of the true underlying picture and kind of allows you to make very different decisions based on that. So yeah, so I think definitely like just being able to measure these things has already been like a massive step change. Like obviously there's always, as researchers, more data we would like. So as Frank already said, like kind of the Leo data has been fantastic at like having this very detailed data on qualifications for a lot of people. Obviously qualifications aren't skills, and particularly when we look at the link between individuals obtaining certain qualifications and their later earnings, I think that has meant sometimes it's kind of hard to know what are the drivers. So for example, thinking about postgraduate degrees, we actually find that a lot of them don't seem to increase people's earnings that much. But at the moment in the data, we can't see what kind of jobs these people get after their degrees, which means we don't really know, is that they can't find kind of the job they want, or is it this degree may not increase their earnings per se, but it has increased kind of the skills they need to do research, and hence they're doing kind of valuable jobs in that regard, or kind of jobs they want more. So kind of really as a like proxy for kind of some other type of skill, like having more information on say industry, occupation, or even, I mean, linked to employers would even be better. I think that really would kind of help us answer some of these very important questions on how qualifications translate into kind of labour market rewards and why.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you all for giving us lots of food for thought to explore. I think probably the first element I'll ask to see if you all have thoughts on. I think we've covered it even in your own discussions, and it's come out a couple of times in the earlier sessions around actually whether the focus should be on the lower end of the skills distribution and the kinds of skills and qualifications that relates to versus the higher end. We saw some presentations focusing on the effect on graduates or the effect on postgraduates. So it'd be useful to see whether between you, whether there's a consideration for one something mattering more than the other in terms of tackling that from a policy and research perspective.
So who's going to answer that one?
I can kick off just very quickly that, I think in a way we should stop saying higher end and lower end, because what we are trying to do is first achieve some parity in the returns to skills and qualifications. We've been trying for a very long time. And now we have got some really higher value added apprenticeships, which could fairly compete with some of the degrees that we have. So I think at least on in the context of leveling up, it's really important to not have that distinction, because it kind of creates some false dichotomies. So parity is one. And then within that, I would say focus more on non-graduate, high quality skills and training.
I mean, I'm not sure your question was as much analysis as policy, but in both of them, I think Urvashi's point is the same for both. On the policy side, as I said, I think I'm less interested on exactly the education as much as there are some groups who are not very well are not well served and have not got great penetration in good education, both across the country and groups. So we obviously keenly need to be aware of that and work policy to make sure that people have the opportunities to have as much education as they can sensibly use, put it that way. And the data, and I think the level of data we have, I mean, again, going back to Leah and other data sets, I mean, admin data sets are so big that you can really do some really low level cuts, which I think are particularly powerful. But from analytically, I mean, I also think that the key thing is to get all the data there in a consistent way. I mean, there has been a lot of work on, for instance, HE returns. I mean, IFS did that great amount of work a couple of years ago, and everyone said, oh, look, creative art's not very good. Economists, brilliant, everyone should do economics. And SEVA done a lot of work at LSE and other places on FE returns. And then IFS and SEVA did something looking at level 4 and 5. And that revealed that actually the data, though we have data on all of it, it's all fairly messy, and there needs to be a lot of more work to actually have a consistent way of looking at education across the scheme. But once we have that, actually it's nearly as easy to do it all at the same time. I don't think we necessarily, I don't think there's much to say to be looking at one area or other. I mean, as I said, there's probably might be some more about thinking about particular groups, one group over another, but I don't think the education, I think it makes as much sense to look at it consistently, or at least I can't think of why you would look at one more than the other.
Yeah, so just to jump in on that, well, firstly, kind of one fun anecdote here is that, so a lot of the research we did on higher education was presented at DFE, and Frank would often sit in the audience and inevitably would put up his hand and be like, but what about FE? Yeah. So I think that kind of shows that really calibrating these two things is important. But related to that, I think particularly in kind of academic research, I think there is the risk of just like a bias towards higher education. Some of that might be data, but also because per definition, all of us have gone through that. And people tend to then just research the questions they kind of think of and are relevant to them. And yes, 50% of the country might go to higher education, but that also means that 50% of the country don't. And they're not the people setting the research agenda. So I think just keeping that in mind, that, yeah, researchers' experience is not always everyone's experience. It's just, yeah, very important.
I think we also have to think about the longevity of education now as well. It's no longer something that you do for 5 years after you finish school. It's now something that we have to change our mindsets on and appreciate that you know it is lifelong learning, and so we're looking over a much longer time span than probably we've ever done before with education, and so it needs to encompass a much wider range of competencies.
Thanks, Catherine. Yeah, and I mean, that came up in a few sessions around whether the focus should be on younger people or across the life course, and there are various reasons you might want to focus on one or the other. Taking a step back a little bit, I guess you covered it to some degree, but be useful to hear what you think are the biggest evidence gaps that could enable further policy-driven, evidence-based policymaking.
Strangely enough, I was at a round table this morning, which we were discussing that with ministers. I chose through a lot of them. On the LEO, LEO is incredibly powerful. We keep talking about that, but actually the data isn't very rich. It's powerful because it's longitudinal, and it's powerful because there's lots of people. But actually, what you see when you have on individual people, it's actually not that much. And I think we can add a lot more things around that one. I see questions coming from Michaela. Sorry, I can't pronounce your surname, about how you identify good work. And we don't know very much about what work people are doing. We know whether they're employed and how much they get paid, and potentially what sector they're in as well, because this data comes from tax records, and to a certain degree HMRC just collects those because it needs them to work out your tax. And there's a role is, can we get more information about the jobs people do? We have no information about that satisfaction. I mean, sometimes they're hard-nosed economists, and sometimes I'm not particularly worried about that one, but I'm very worried about what jobs they're actually doing in occupations. I think that's incredibly useful, and stuff like that. And I think there's a role there to potentially see if we can get more data through admin data sources. HMRC obviously have got a reasonable case to say we have to collect data for tax and what any more data, there's costs and benefits to that, so we have to be careful. But I think there may be some roles there, and other countries do collect more data through their admin government data. But there's also obviously surveys, and linking surveys to admin data is another way of adding a lot of richness to the data. So I mean, there's lots more. I won't go through my whole lot, so I'm sure other people have got some other ideas. I'll leave them to bring in some other bits of data.
That's right. Any other thoughts on that? Biggest evidence gaps?
I touched on this when I talked earlier, but the idea of a linked employer-employee data set, so that we could actually really start to identify the link between workers and performance at the firm level, I think would be really, really helpful. And I don't think we really have enough depth in the UK data to really look at that. And I think that would be something that I would be very keen for.
Thank you.
Can I just ask? I'll throw in one more, because then someone might tell me how we're going to do it. The only data we have we don't have, as I already said, we don't actually have data on skills. We have data on qualifications, and we need to actually get under those qualifications for skills. But 80% of the population, or everyone over the age of 30, we know precious little even about their qualifications beyond LFS, which is very small. So there is a role to say how adult skills, and adult skills are becoming increasingly important, because most job moves are between adults outside this. But secondly, is we're going to probably have to do more and more education if we're right and the economy is changing and all these sort of things. And indeed, for leveling up, if we are going to level up, it's mostly about adults already in the labour market to achieve the 2030 targets. In terms of job and economic changes. So, I mean, we know precious little about those. So again, I'm not sure how we get at that. There's no obvious way to get information on people's skills. We can do surveys, but they obviously are typically small. So, if anyone has any great thoughts about how we could get into that, is one of the areas we're going to look at. I'd be really grateful to hear those.
Well, just to follow up a little bit on that, you mentioned about there are potentials for further surveys, but they tend to be obviously small by definition. Is that persistent problem in this area, and I guess with it being linked to leveling up and regional disparities, or is it more that we just really want to know a very granular information, and hence surveys would just never really do everything we want them to?
I mean, there are some surveys. There's the skills employment survey is one that springs to mind, which I know is used a lot, and is that Alan Feltman and is it Francis Green, I think, put those together. But they are still only every 5 years. I think they're very valuable, but and it does pick up things, and I think they've been used incredibly usefully in research. But I suppose I'm looking from as much a policymaker's perspective and think, as a sense about where we're going, and that there still are, I think, I can't remember, it's probably tens of thousands sample size and done every 5 years. So they are often lagged, and they don't give you I'm not sure the longitudinal either. So there's a lot of sort of shortages beyond that. So I think that shows surveys are great, but they are often limited. And I think Leo has showed us, and probably spoiled us, to say, how can we get big data sets over a number of years timely? I mean, one way that's been discussed is to actually just look at occupations and infer the skills based on people's occupations, which probably is the way we're going to go first of all. But and maybe some surveys would be helpful to sort of check whether that's actually right or not. But I'm not sure.
I think an interesting development there is the linking actually of surveys to these administrative data sets. So for example, you have the, well, growing up in England data set, which links kind of census data to the MPD. You're having, certain other kind of surveys, also older people, linked to other administrative data sets, which kind of allows you to fill in some of the gaps kind of both directions. So I think, obviously that's still not perfect, like you're still going to be limited by the sample for that, but I do think, that kind of helps mitigate some of the concerns with both.
Great. Well, just to elaborate, I guess, a little bit more, because I think you've all touched on it to varying degrees. I think we've talked quite a bit on the what you might call the skills supply side, but we've all raised about the issue of making sure that we consider demand against supply. I think there was a couple of sessions earlier in the day around the challenges and difficulties in doing that with the current data that we have. So from the perspective of skill demand, is there perhaps more promise based on the commercial data that is becoming more and more available and is already being used across academics and government departments?
When I started this job, I remember chatting UKCES about skills demand, and lots of people often say, "Oh, the government always concentrates on supply and doesn't think about demand enough," which I'm sure is completely true. I think one reason is, well, there's at least two which are linked. One is we don't measure demand very well, so government's concentrating on the things it can see. And secondly, I don't think we have a very good understanding of how demand, what the levers are on demand. So if you ask government how we're going to affect demand, it's really tricky, and we have no simple sort of pull this lever and this happens. And I think the lack of data sort of contributes to that. So I do think we need better measurement of demand, but we actually need a better theory of demand as well, or framework, or policy sort of framework to that. I remember, as I say, when UKCES was around, I remember discussing it with them. They had a very number of blocks together with arrows, but I don't think that actually approached a model. So yes, we need that. What interestingly, where are we going to get stuff? I do think, and Georgia, you might know more, that I think there's going to be some sort of job vacancy data is likely to improve. I mean, there isn't much around. What's around has been commercial and has got sort of licensing agreement. The burning glass is the obvious example. But my hope is quite soon that we'll have better sort of data on that. I mean, vacancies, again, have limitations. I was chatting to Andy Dickinson just today, and he would tell you, obviously, vacancies are the jobs which are sort of businesses are the last resort when they go and put it online. It's usually they look internally and move people around, and it's their sort of last resort when they go on these public-facing websites. So, but they are probably most timely way into that one. So I think we start there. Interestingly, and actually it also answers my last question, which is how to get a stock of skills. I mean, there are things like LinkedIn around, And LinkedIn will probably give you an idea about better idea of demand, because you see people's changes in roles within that. And secondly, it actually potentially gives you a way of looking at stock of skills, because people say what skills I have in there and stuff like that. Now, of course, LinkedIn, and I don't know if anyone has any other ideas about where you'd look up, their data is very sort of protected and proprietary. I can never say that word properly. And I'd be intrigued to see how we could get more sort of access to that. But that, of course, is commercially held data, and we don't have any access to it as much as anywhere else.
Can I just jump in here? A couple of thoughts following what you were saying, Frank. I do think that we need to exploit more real-time data, being quite mindful that context is important. For example, the skills, the shortages that we have seen more recently are obviously triggered by not by a shift in skills demand, but by other factors. So we do need to understand what we are seeing and why. But I think combining survey-based measures with more real-time data, if it's not LinkedIn, it's other ways of looking at it, would be really good. The other question is more of a question and observation, perhaps for you, Frank, in your new role, is how do we get better at anticipating or planning for skills transition? So we've got net zero, and government's green jobs task force saying that there will be a significant transformation required, not just in new industries, but in existing traditional industries, transitioning to new jobs. And I just don't know how we actually measure that, given that there will be a bit of, I guess, market failure where the employers will not have the incentives to upskill their workforce unless they're really pushed. And government will probably not anticipate, in the context of drivers, what needs to be done on the supply side to drive up incentives.
Hard question. I mean, it's a very good question, being my title of my unit, which I didn't choose personally, includes the word future skills. I would say most of my work for the next year is going to focus on present skills, and indeed probably skills from a few months ago, because given the data lags. And I think for most cases, having a very good idea about what skills markets, jobs and skills markets are at the moment is a fairly, well, first of all, it's good to know at the moment. The second is actually probably a good indicator of what it's going to be in the next 5 or 10 years. I know there's, that's answering your question, because you said holidays in transition, and there will be some, and the ones in transition by their nature are very both important and tricky. But so I think the first one is we just need to get better data of the now, and then that in many cases is probably a very good example of what it's going to be in 5 years' time. And my work with Work in Futures, someone we came across, and I actually commissioned Work in Futures, and I do think it's useful, but I think the use can be overrated, and I do think in most cases, and that's a sort of 10-year trend analysis. I do think its accuracy is not great, but where the actual transition, I think the answer to do future skills, and I think again we're having meetings today and discuss it, is going to be not trying to predict future skills for the economy overall, but to look at particular areas. If I'm going to be a bit like Taleb, it's a sort of, if not the black swans, it's going to be the sort of grey swans, and where there's transition going on. I think it's going to be tricky. I mean, we've seen in green skills. I'm not sure how it's going to be done, other than getting lots of people who know a lot about the sort of systems management, engineering requirements, of what's to do with green skills and going through and say this is what's going to change, and hopefully we have the skills toolkits to say if you need more of those, if you need more heat pump engineers, which is obviously the cliched example, heat pump, they need to have plumbing and electronics and doing that sort of modeling. I think that's possible, but it's actually the area which is I have less knowledge of will be obviously the industrial demand side about what the sector is going to look like. And I think that's just a very simple, let's say simple, I'm sure it's not simple, but sort of someone going through and doing some scenario planning about what it might look like. I do think CITB is an example, the Construction Industrial Training Board do a lot of this where there's how many houses are going to be built next year, and they have all these models to say we need this many plasterers and so on and so forth. Of course, the technology might change, and maybe if we don't get enough plasterers, we come up with a different way of building houses, and that's not in their models, and we need to take it like that. But I think it might be a very sector-driven, technology-driven sort of deep dives more than a necessarily skills-led approach. But obviously, you need the skills there to convert there. We need this many people to be able to do this with the skills required and potentially the training needed. And that's what I think the Unit Future Skills or the skills economists and sort of academics and researchers can bring. But I'm interested. I mean, as I said, this is a very open question, which I'm not really sure of. So if anyone's got any other ideas, ideally better, I definitely take them off you.
Great, thanks. There's a couple of questions in the Q&A, so pass over to cover some of those, and then we can maybe encourage others to put questions if they want them answered. So firstly, we can start with Sanjeev.
Thanks, Gueorguie. Thanks for the panel. I went to have a cup of tea and a cup of Wotsits to get reinvigorated. So food is good for my brain and good for my productivity, I think, in the afternoon. But no, a couple of quick points. There's a lot of focus, obviously, today on academic qualifications and FE and not including them, whatever. But should we start to think about how we give more weighting to genuine and pure knowledge and experience? Because there are many school leavers leave with the basic qualifications and go on to really successful careers. So there's that dimension. But also, as we're living longer and we work longer, there's lots of people post-retirement coming back into the work employment type field. And therefore, their knowledge and experience is becoming more valued because some companies are not getting that throughput from the younger generation, so to speak. So that also opens up questions on life lengths of human capital stock, where you might think when they come out of the workforce, that's it. But they're actually coming back in. So that's one area of discussion, I think. And then another one is the analysis a bit skewed? Because there's a lot of information on the manufacturing industry and the skills required and lots of granularity. But the services is a lot more heterogeneous. There's a whole diverse set of skills required, posts and occupations. I can imagine the top 10 occupations 10 years ago probably doesn't look anything like the top 10 occupations today. And then likewise, the demand for the top 10 skills 10 years ago compared to today. So that's completely changing. So there's an issue about services versus manufacturing. And then I'm going to throw in a bonus. And that is, in terms of the measurement, we haven't had as much discussion as I thought we would on the stock of human capital versus the flow of human capital. Now, it's really difficult to measure both, but I think it's really difficult to work out what on earth is the accumulated stock of the living UK population from their schooling 60, 70, 80 years ago. What is that stock? But does the stock of human capital not just live with the living humans, but the human capital generated by people who passed away from their research, development, inventions, etc.? So that's the little nugget I'll give to you as an extra bonus. Thanks. Back to you, Gueorguie.
Thanks, Sanjeev. I didn't realize there was 4 questions in one there. So yeah, I guess I'll open it up to panelists to see what questions they want to tackle. So the first one being knowledge and experience versus academic qualifications. Second, focus on living and working longer. third about perhaps too much of a focus on manufacturing versus services, and the fourth on the discussion between stocks and flows.
I'll have a first go. If you hear any scratching, I have a dog by my feet. Please ignore it. You're completely right. We concentrate too much on qualifications, but I think we do that for two reasons. One is we pay for qualifications, and they are what drive our policy, which is probably a bad reason, but it's true. Another reason, which you can argue is bad, but slightly more intractable, is we measure qualifications partly because we pay for them, so we collect data on it. So nearly all our data is on qualifications. So we measure those, so we manage them, and we look and research them. And I think it's much harder to measure skills. And I think to measure skills would have to change in some ways the education system beyond just the measurement system, or we need to come up with some really good ways of doing it. So you're completely right, but to change it is challenging, which is not to say we shouldn't do it, and I think we're going to start trying to do some of that. But I don't think we'll have the level of coverage for a long time that we do with the qualifications area of things. And that comes in, I will leave the last one about the sort of, is technology a sort of embedded human capital? I mean, I think that's an interesting philosophical question. But just to pick on the one on the SOC codes, which effectively, I think when you say manufacturing versus services, there's as much to do with occupations and sectors as not. I do know ONS, and indeed ONS colleagues who report much better than me. There's been a lot of work. I mean, SOC, our classification system, both in SOC and in sectors and in occupations, lag. So they're always going to be behind. There's always going to be, and I think there is a bias towards manufacturing beyond just purely the natural lag in there. But I do know we just had a sort of reshuffling of the pack with much more sort of sector qualifications coming out. I think, was it last year or year before? And I think hopefully that's improved things, and they will make that sort of better data there with better classifications will help us with the skill side. I'm sure it will still continue lagging, because it always does, because we're always about the classification is always 5 years behind, at least where we're at, probably 10 years behind, but it's getting better.
So yeah, just to say, if I can, just to come in on that point specifically, Frank, yeah, one of the reasons why our analysis only goes to 2020 is because we've got a blasted SOC code to deal with, change that slows down the progress of trying to calculate the traditional occupation classification. And it's one of the reasons why we went for that other approach, the Liu et al. Approach, that was based on degree types and sector in which people work, just because it gave us that different lens. So we wanted to sort of see how these two combinations of skill mismatch came together. So I can see that there's a classification challenge there. I think traditionally we always focus on manufacturing as economists, simply because it's more tangible. We can see it, we understand it, it makes sense to us within our theoretical frameworks, and so I think that's where we start. Hopefully it's not where we stop, and so things will improve, I'm sure, on that front. I thought it was an interesting point, Sanjeev, about the idea that the skills demands have probably changed a lot over the past 10 years. I'm not so sure they will have changed that much, to be honest. I think there may be some changes at the edges, but I would have thought in terms of the sort of sophistication of the skills, but I would have thought they'd still be broadly in the same sort of areas. But that's maybe my view. Yeah, and the focus on academic qualifications, we measure them because we can, and I think that's really where we end up with that one. It's not it is incomplete, but it's the best we can do. I like the idea of knowledge and experience and finding a way to capture it better rather than just counting years, because I don't think that really captures that captures everything. And I think you're right, there's a lot embodied in individuals and individuals who train others and support others in the workplace. But again, maybe a topic for a conversation over a glass of something rather than.
Thanks, Catherine. Yeah, just to add on a bit of perspective from my point of view around the experience and knowledge side, and it does seem as if the solution, at least the solutions that we've discussed today and have been discussed earlier in earlier sessions around measuring those things, means that you are then forced to look at smaller survey sources if you do want to get at anything more granular. Although there have been some interesting insights from early sessions, such as the presentation from the University of Cambridge on local variation in personality traits, and that, you know, there's a huge data set there which allows for lots of local variation and is, you know, not a traditional survey or admin data source. So there's other ways of potentially filling some of those gaps. Just to follow up on the point around transitions, there was as you might imagine, there was quite a lot of discussion around the pandemic and how the pandemic has impacted on all of these things. So I was just wondering if you'd had any thoughts on how the way that the labour market is evolving or has already evolved from the pandemic might be changing what we need to be considering around skills. So, you know, the obvious things that come to mind are things like home working, but there are various other factors. And yeah, just wondering if you think that they're actually fundamental to what we're thinking about.
I think this taps into Urvashi's point actually around those different capitals, and I think certainly I've been involved in some work that's looked at the capital skill complementarity, and I think looking at those new technologies and how they interact with skills is going to be a really fruitful area for research going forward. But I'm sure others will have views.
I mean, I remember the beginning of COVID or whatever in March, and everyone was sort of taking their tuppence worth of what the economy is going to evolve. I think my view, which is still about the same, was I think I said I was in the V-shaped sort of recovery. But I think Martin Wolf and other people, I was with him. In some ways, even though it hasn't been V-shaped, it's been a very U as in much of the period. I mean, a lot of the sort of response has been that recovery has been quick as the demand returned. I think that's broadly right. But the other thing was that I still think this is the economy is probably going to change less than we think. And we are going to return back to a lot of the things we saw. And so there's probably going to be other aspects of economic challenge, not least technology and possibly globalization and our relationship with Europe and areas which might potentially are more substantial. While COVID isn't. The only thing, and actually, Catherine said, the thing, as you said, I think isn't much. And the thing which I would change is this potential interaction with through remote working and how, strangely enough, I mean, the pros and cons. Suddenly, it's much easier to organise meetings and have discussions, which probably makes spreading skills of the broad thing much easier in human capital. But are there other skills about how to run meetings like that we should be learning? Indeed, maybe distance learning at universities is ideal because then we learn how to do these sort of meetings as well. But so there's probably some. I still think that there will be other events which are probably structurally more important for the economy and changes than COVID. But there's probably some key things that we need to look at. But hey, I'm in DFE, so I don't need much more.
Can I just come in on that? I think, Frank, you're probably right that at a macro level, you might not see a lot of change. But I think at sectoral, regional levels, you could see some of the pre-existing inequalities worsening. So there is a school of thought that says that hybrid working and remote working would actually benefit the higher skilled more, because you've got those workers concentrated in, you know, sectors that can afford to do hybrid working. So suddenly, instead of spreading those higher skills more equitably across regions, you might see further concentration in London and the Southeast. And this is why I think it's important to keep tracking what is happening at a micro level. And that's a measurement point, but I do think we can't let our eyes off the ball. And what happened after the financial crisis is, you know, there was a lot of focus on job creation. You know, economy had a shock, and it was really important to get people back into jobs. The focus was on quantity, not quality, and you did see a drop in the quality of the labor market, which the likes of IFS Resolution Foundation have written a lot about. I think we are at risk of going down that path again, because there is a lot of policy focus on getting people into jobs. We already know that some people will not benefit as much as others, or haven't been benefiting as much as others. Some labor markets are more resilient than others. So I do think that quality of jobs and where the disproportionate impacts might fall post-pandemic is something that we probably have to be very closely watching for the next 18 months or so.
I think you're right. I think you're right. Though when we have so many vacancies, and though wages haven't taken off hugely, but so many signs of possibly a tight labour market, I do think there'll be a question where many people might be moving jobs into what potentially is better jobs. Interestingly, I just picked this up because I just finished it a couple of days ago. Saheem Zahar's exponential book about, I mean, if you believe him, I mean, COVID is going to be small beer to the fact that technology is growing so quickly, and in there, a couple of the themes he picked out, which are both that high skill versus low skill, and technology rewarding high skill so much more, and the exponential growth of high technology, and what do the sort of low skill do. I mean, a lot of these ideas about unions and sort of basic incomes, but skilling is part of that. But also, and interestingly, pick up your idea of locality, rise of the cities outside as this sort of technology being much more post-city than towns and sort of rural areas. And again, what does that mean? I think that, but whether it's right or wrong, I think these sort of trends, technology and is probably much more powerful and will begin becoming more apparent just because that's exponential does. I mean, they start slow and get very quick, and we're very much in the getting quick stage as it feels at the moment. I think will be more important than a pandemic, this particular pandemic. But anyway, we'll find out in 5 years' time.
Yeah, I think there's one more point. Like, obviously now we're talking about like people already in the labour market and labour market itself, but like obviously what's different to other kind of crises or recessions is just the impact this has had on kids currently in school, who might not enter the labour market for quite a long time, but might still be very much impacted, and also differentially impacted based on, say, region or socioeconomic background. So I think this is not just something for the kind of next 18 months, but really something we might potentially see like for quite a long time. Yeah, and I think that's quite an important distinction with the kind of previous recessions.
So yeah, thank you, everyone. Well, I'm afraid we're out of time. We've just run over a little bit, but I just want to thank all the attendees for staying on, and for all the panelists for your very useful insights. So it's just left to me to close the session. So again, I want to thank all of the presentations from throughout the 3 sessions and the panelists of today. And I hope that you have all found it very useful. We'll be looking to circulate some feedback around the session, and hopefully that makes its way to you. And the sessions, because they've been recorded, should be made available as well. We'll also look to make the slides from the earlier sessions to circulate to all attendees as well. But yeah, just leave it there, and thank you very much, everyone, for attending.
That's right. Quick plug, if anyone wants to talk to me about the unit of future skills and research we might be doing. This is a very foolish question, but do feel free to email frank.bowley@education.gov.uk. We're in the very much listening phase at the moment. And I realise this is the problem with conferences, virtual conferences. I can't be grabbed by people afterwards. So feel free to electronically grab me. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.